Show of hands out there. How many people have a little Irish in them? How do I know that? I tell you, these Irish people keep coming to my lectures. I don't know why. Speaking of Irish, I am fifth generation Irish, and what got me interested in the Irish in Boston, Irish in general, was I did some genealogy. How many people have done genealogy? Yes. I love it. When you first get started, you run into the same brick wall. Born in Ireland, born in Ireland, born in Ireland. And it took me a while to break through that wall and find out that my great-great-grandfather came from Bantry in the late 1840s, landed in St. John's, New Brunswick, and walked to Bangor, Maine. By the end of his life, he owned a lumber yard and was pretty well off. So that was very interesting for me to find out after several years of searching for that history. And I found out also, as I went through my family, I am fifth generation Irish, and as far as I can tell, 100% Irish after 5 generations. But don't tell my wife. She's Portuguese. She's Native American. She's French. I call her. I married the United Nations. You know. And but this journey has taken me to this lecture here, and I delved deep into the history of the Irish in Boston, and I was pretty shocked at a lot of the stuff I found. But it's a story. It's a real jubilant and hopeful story. And you know, when you hear about all these other immigrant groups, you know, I hope people would come that aren't Irish and see what the Irish did. Contrary to popular belief, the Irish were not the first in Boston. It was the Puritans. Now, it's funny. I don't know your experience in school, but when I went to school, I learned the Puritans and the Pilgrims, the Separatists, came here seeking religious freedom. That's where it ended. From what I didn't know, nobody ever taught me that, from who I didn't know, but they came here seeking religious freedom. And they were called Puritans. Why were they called Puritans? Were they just very pure people? I never learned that in school. It was years later with my own research that I found out why they were called the Puritans. And it's because of this gentleman. Henry VIII, I am. Henry VIII, as you probably know, was the English king that broke away from the Catholic Church simply because the Pope wouldn't give an annulment. He wanted to get a divorce, in other words. And he didn't get that permission for the Pope, so he just broke away from the Catholic Church, in essence made himself the Pope of the Anglican Church and changed the rules so you could get a divorce. Now, if you walked into a Anglican church today, you might even think you were in a Catholic church. They kept almost everything the same. Now, during this same period, there were other people out there who were breaking away from the Catholic Church for more spiritual reasons, not because they wanted a divorce. One of the leading reformers was this fellow. This is John Calvin. Now, Calvin came shortly after Martin Luther, who was the original reformer. And he had this whole theory that he put forth that Christians should go back to the early days of the Christian church, that they should not do anything unless it is expressly said in Scripture, in the Bible. Anything that had been made up by popes or councils or anything like that was illegitimate. Any statues, any ceremony, all this stuff, they wanted to throw out. They wanted to purify the Anglican Church. This is why they were called Puritans. They followed this guy Calvin here. Now, to give you a little contrast, if we go just down the road, I think, you might find yourself inside of this church. Puritan Church, the Ship's Church. And I didn't just stick that in there because it's Hingham. I use this normally. And see how bare it is? Do you see any crosses or anything that smacks of Catholicism? This is what the Puritans wanted. They wanted to purify the church. Now, they had problems with the Anglicans. The Anglicans did not appreciate them. They did not want them. And eventually, many of the Puritans, starting with the Pilgrims, who were separatists, they were like radical Puritans, they wanted to separate, came to America to practice their religion the way they saw fit. And they came to America. Now, these Puritans that settled Boston, first they arrived in Salem. There were already a couple people in Salem. They didn't like Salem, so they moved down to Charlestown, and then they moved over to a place called Shawmut, and this is where they would build their city on a hill. The Indians called it Shawmut. It was a little peninsula. It actually turned into an island at high tide. And this is where they were going to plant their city on the hill. Their shining example of what Christianity should be. This strict, gospel-driven Christianity. Now we say that, oh, they were the first ones for freedom of religion. They weren't for freedom of religion. They were for freedom of religion for them, not anybody else. Anybody else that did anything else was a heretic to them. Now, if you were to go down just after they started this brand new shining city on the hill and stand about where State Street is today and look towards Beacon Hill, that's probably the site you would have seen. That's what Beacon Hill looked like when it was really a hill and had a beacon on it. And you know, the Irish were close behind the Puritans. The first Irish, almost immediately on the heels of the Puritans. The thing is, they did not come here of their own free will. They were brought here. They were brought here as indentured servants. And here's another thing I learned in school. Indentured servants, they were someone, an indentured servant was somebody who wanted to come here, actually paid somebody who was already over here, or actually the person who was already over here paid for them to come over, and to repay that, they would work for 5 to 7 years and hopefully learn a trade. That's the way it went. A lot of people came over here that way. But these Irish, these first Irish that came to our country, were not brought that way. They were brought here against their will. So this indentured servant tag that's been attached to the original Irish is kind of a misnomer. Now, it all happened because of this fella. Now, as I already mentioned, there was a lot of conflict between the Puritans and the Anglicans. There was a civil war in England, and the Puritans won. And they chopped the head off of the king. King Charles lost his head. And this man took over, Oliver Cromwell. He was the head of the army that did this. And they asked him if he wanted the crown, and he said, "No, I will be Lord Protector." Now, just after they won the Civil War, the Puritans took power, and he was at the head, and he started to hear these rumblings coming back from Ireland. Now, the English had been involved in Ireland probably going back to the days of William the Conqueror, back in 1066. They had been meddling in Irish politics, taking their land for centuries, up and down. It kind of waned and went back up and down. Now, what happened was he was hearing rumblings from Ireland that the Irish were actually committing atrocities against their English landlords. They were fighting, I guess today you'd call them freedom fighters. But he heard that they were doing all these horrible things like chopping people up and decapitating them and all these horrible stories, which, you know, in hindsight, now when we look at the history, these stories were actually exaggerations. They weren't true. Nevertheless, Cromwell decided that he was going to go over to Ireland and he was going to teach them a lesson. He took his new model army, as they termed it, and turned it towards Ireland. And he landed in Ireland, and his first target was the city of Drogheda. Now, Drogheda was an old medieval walled city, and he marched his troops and they surrounded the city, and they said to the mayor, "Give up!" And you know what the mayor said? "I won't tell you." He basically told him to go take a leap. So Cromwell did what they call wave the red flag. That means if you don't give up, there will be no quarter, there will be no mercy. They still said, go take a leap. So there was a long siege, and finally they breached the wall. They got into Drogheda. They killed every soldier they could get their hands on, and then they started going into the civilian population. That number is not soldiers, it's civilians. 4,000 people murdered in the streets of Drogheda. Once he had Drogheda down, he set his sights on Wexford. Same scenario, just less people. And then he went, and lastly, he took over Waterford and the same scenario. These are all civilian casualties. By this time, Ireland was on her knees. The rebellion, whatever it was snuffed out. But this wasn't good enough for Cromwell. You know, the objective of the English for a long time had been to colonize and take over Ireland. What better way to do that than get them out of Ireland? And this is how they did it. Look at this figure. Can you believe this? In the 1650s, over 100,000 Irish children were wrenched from their parents and sent into indentured servitude in the Americas, and that includes New England. That's not all. Many men and women were also imprisoned and sent over here against their will. This is how the Irish first came to Boston. And you can imagine, this is probably a scene where you have these Irish newly arrived, they're beaten, they're worn from the trip over, and here's their Puritan master almost. And you know the first thing they did once they got here, once they stepped foot on this land, was that they ran away. Look at this. Now you hear about runaway slaves all the time. This is a runaway slave ad. There's actually two people here. Let's blow it up a little bit. Here we have a Negro fellow who they're looking for, and here we have an Irishman. And in a lot of cases, the Irish would run away with the African Americans. The only thing, it was easier to slip into the population as an Irishman, as long as you kept your mouth shut. You didn't have that Gaelic coming out. The black guys, you know, you could pick them out of a crowd very easily. That's why they ended up being permanent indentured servants. Easy to find. And if you ran away, you might end up here in the pillory. Doesn't that look like a nice day? Just getting some sun, hanging out. Maybe this is where the term hanging out came from. It wasn't. This was horribly humiliating because you would be put in the pillory in the center of town, and everybody in town would go and get all their old garbage and rotten eggs and old rotten heads of lettuce, tomatoes, and start throwing them at you and heckling you as you're in the pillory. You would get to withstand that for about a day. Now that doesn't sound fun to me. Humiliating. And here's the sitting version. And also, it could get this bad. You could be taken out, whipped at the cart's tail. This was very common too. Might think twice about running away next time. Now, there was a voluntary Irish migration, and that didn't happen until the 1700s. And it's what we call the Scots-Irish. This is another blank spot in my education too. Nobody ever told me who the Scots-Irish were. I just thought they were like Irish people like to drink scotch or something like that. The Scots-Irish actually were Presbyterian Scottish that were brought over to Northern Ireland to colonize Northern Ireland. During this Puritan time, the Puritans hooked up with the Presbyterians, both Calvinists. They both believed in Calvin, not really any difference religiously, just a different name pretty much. And they were fellow Calvinists. So they encouraged the Scottish Presbyterians to colonize Northern Ireland, and a great influx of Scottish came in and took over Northern Ireland. This is why you have that Protestant nut at the top of Northern Ireland here. It's all Scots-Irish. Now, they were doing very well up until about 10 years after Cromwell took over. They decided they didn't want the Puritans anymore, and the Puritans pretty much fell apart. They imploded, they lost power, and they decided to bring back the king. Only problem was the king didn't have a head. So what do? The next best thing is the king's son, Charles II. They brought him back, they reinstalled him, and the royal family was back. And guess who's on the outs now? The Puritans and the Presbyterians. Pretty soon, within a few years, they started passing legislation against the Puritans, against the Presbyterians, and you get this law, the 1704 Sacramental Test. Essentially what this said was, if you're not an Anglican minister, you cannot preach. So what do? You're in Northern Ireland, you're a Presbyterian, and you can't go to your Puritan church anymore. So you go to America, because in America, the Puritans have free reign still. They control Boston, they control New England, and in fact, they were encouraged to come here by this gentleman. This is Cotton Mather. Maybe you've heard of him from the Salem witch trials, maybe. He had quite a correspondence with these folks and encouraged them to come over. So they financed a trip, a fleet, and they came over here, and they thought that they were going to come into the bosom of their friendly Puritan friends here. When they got here, they found it was quite a different thing. When they got here, they were told that they pretty much only a few of them could stay in Boston, but what we want most of you to do is to go out on the frontier. We want you to go to what is now Western Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, kind of as a buffer in between the Puritans in Boston and the Indians. What they didn't count on was they may have been fellow Calvinists, but they were still Scottish. And the Scottish and the English do not get along. Scottish and Irish now, because they were becoming Irish. So this, to give you an idea of how the Puritans felt about these new Scots-Irish, this is what they called. They had a little church in Boston, the ones that were allowed to stay in Boston, and this is what the Puritans called this church. It was called the Church of Presbyterian Strangers. Yeah. So the Scots-Irish came in, and there was even some prejudice against them as well. By the way, this church was at the site of this building here. This is the building that is now where this church was. Maybe you recognize it, huh? That is the Bank of Boston, which is on Federal Street. And I couldn't fit the whole thing in there, so I did this. Now that church, the congregation still exists today. The church may not be there because they moved over to Arlington Street. The Arlington Street Congregational Church, I guess you could say, is the descendant of that Presbyterian Church of Strangers. So even though you have a small nugget of Irish, a mixture of Scots-Irish, Irish Catholic, you start to see a lot of animosity going back and forth here, because the Puritans, there was nothing about the Catholic Church that they liked. They wanted to eradicate it. And most Irish that were in Boston were Irish Catholics. And you can tell, you start to see things like this. This is a law that was passed in 1647 called the Anti-Catholic Law. This was spurred on because there were rumors in Boston that there was a Jesuit priest. Ooh. So they decided to pass this law. Let me read you the text of the law. It's quite fascinating. Death to all and every Jesuit seminary priest, missionary, or other spiritual ecclesiastical person made or ordained by any authority, power, jurisdiction, derived, challenged, or pretended from the Pope or See of Rome. Translation: no Catholics. No priests, no Catholics. And we don't even know if there was a Jesuit priest, but one wonders if there were Irish Catholics in Boston, how did they worship? Maybe there was some kind of underground church where they maybe worshipped in each other's homes or basements, who knows? Maybe there was a Jesuit priest skulking around Boston, but he better lay low now. This is the tone. This is what the Irish came to. And then there was the Goodwife Glover incident. Goody Glover was a woman who was brought over as an indentured servant to the Barbados and somehow made her way up here, and she ended up being a servant of some Puritan family. And a couple of the kids died, and there was a rumor that she yelled at them before they died. And you know what that meant. Oh, she was a witch. And if you wanted to tell if somebody was a witch, you got the How to Find If Somebody's a Witch handbook written by Cotton Mather. The first thing you do is ask the suspected witch to recite the Lord's Prayer. Okay. Well, Goody Glover, she knew how to say the Lord's Prayer. But she said it, and she said it in Latin. Ooh, that was a big mistake. So technically, she could not say the Lord's Prayer because you had to say it in English. She couldn't say it in English. Just on those grounds, she was found guilty and she was hanged as a witch. Goodwife Glover. She was an elderly woman who really died just for the sin of being Irish and being Catholic. If you go to the North End today, there's a restaurant called Goody Glover's. And this plaque is on the side of their wall there. It refers to her as the first Irish martyr in Boston. And there's a little portrait of her on the wall. We don't know what she looked like, but we do know she was an elderly woman, hanged for the crime of being Irish and Catholic. Welcome to Boston. Want to go back to England? Had enough of Boston? Well, in England, they have a wonderful holiday that they celebrate on November 5th. It's kind of like our 4th of July. And it all started because a group of Catholics wanted to blow Parliament sky high. And they had actually secreted barrels of gunpowder into the basement of Parliament and were planning on, in the next session, when there was a full House of Commons and Lords, boom, just lighten it up. Now, the reason why, you might say, why would they celebrate this? The reason why is because this plot was foiled. The fellow who was left to guard the gunpowder, his name was Guy Fawkes. This is why they call it Guy Fawkes Day. And he was caught, arrested, and brought to the Tower of London. Now, they knew that Guy Fawkes wasn't the only one involved here. So, in the Tower of London, they persuaded him to tell about his Confederates. And he gave up everything. He told about who was involved, what they were going to do, and one by one, they were brought in. They were all arrested. Here they are. Now, they were tried, and the charge was treason. And in 17th century England, Britain, you did not want to be charged with treason. This was the worst thing possible. They were convicted and charged. They were sentenced to death. But it wasn't just death that traitors got. They got a special punishment, something being drawn and quartered, hanged, drawn, and quartered. Now, this is why we have the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, no cruel and unusual punishment. First, you would be dragged to the gallows. Then you would be put on the gallows, noose around your neck, and they would haul you up. Just when you're within an inch of your life, let you down gasping. Then you would be tied to a table, and then they'd take a giant knife and slit you from stem to stern and start pulling out your intestines as you are alive. You're still conscious. Hopefully you're not conscious. And then they would do the pièce de résistance. I can't speak French too well. They'd do the quartering. This is how the quartering was done. That's cruel and unusual punishment. Now, Guy Fawkes, they saved him to the last. And he saw his friends go one by one. He knew what was waiting for him, and he got up there in chains, and he was on the edge of the scaffold, and he noticed a big rock. So he took a dive and smashed his head on a rock and cheated the executioner. Now you might be saying, what does this have to do with Boston? What does this have to do with Irish? In Boston, they celebrated the same holiday, but they didn't call it Guy Fawkes Day in Boston. They called it Pope's Day. And what they would do is they would, each neighborhood in Boston would make their own effigy of the Pope and cart it around the city. And the other neighborhoods would try to tear it apart. And the game was, at the end of the day, the neighborhood whose effigy was still intact won the day, and they'd have a big celebration. That was Pope's Day. Now, this went on right up until the middle of the Revolutionary War. In fact, just after the British were kicked out of Boston, it stopped because this gentleman witnessed it. I don't know if you know his name. He's on the dollar bill. He saw it, he was appalled. He was appalled because he had many men in his army that were Irish and they were Catholic and they were fighting for this country, and how dare they do this. In fact, the man that brought the cannon to Dorchester Heights, Henry Knox, was an Irishman. And he ordered a stop put to this foolishness, and it never happened ever again after that. So, after a while, things calmed down a little bit, and the Irish start, I hate to use this because it's always used in the news, the Irish start to come out from out of the shadows. And the first Mass that was ever held was held right here at the corner of School and Washington Street. Actually, that's where the Irish Famine Memorial is. There was a building there. And this was the first Mass, not only in Boston, but in all of New England. Look at that date, 1788. The Irish had been here since the mid-1600s. They had to wait that long for one church. Nobody died. Nobody got arrested. I guess they're not enforcing that anti-Catholic law anymore. Then finally, the Church of the Holy Cross was built, the first cathedral in 1803. This is no longer. The newer one is elsewhere, but where it was located was up on Franklin Street, and there's a marker on Franklin Street still. The building where it was located looks like this. This was actually in control of the Boston Archdiocese up until recently. So they're coming out of the shadows, and then the first burial ground was not incorporated until 1818. St. Augustine's in South Boston, up on Dorchester Ave. This was the first Irish Catholic burial ground. And it begs the question, what did they do before this? I grew up Irish Catholic, and I was taught that you had to be buried in a cemetery, consecrated ground. What did they do if there were no cemeteries? Did a priest just come and sprinkle some holy water or something? We know that the Irish Catholics that died prior to the cemetery were probably put in paupers' graves because they've uncovered bodies doing road work and things where they bump into these bodies and they know they're Irish from the artifacts on the bodies. So that's kind of the answer. We know that they were just buried in paupers' graves. The first Irish Catholic newspaper, the Boston Pilot, now there's news. People are starting to communicate. And then it begins as a trickle. I always say, if you went on the street and asked the common person, so when did the Irish first come to America? With the education level these days, they might say, well, it had something to do with that potato thingy. Maybe in the 1920s or something like that. Well, it actually didn't begin with the potato thingy. A lot of Irish left willingly in the 1820s. And they left because they had a little bit of money and they saw the writing on the wall. This is the writing on the wall. The British Parliament passed these penal laws against the Irish. Let me read you some of these. The Irish Catholic was forbidden to exercise his religion, forbidden to receive an education, forbidden to enter a profession, to hold public office, to engage in trade or commerce. Further on down here, you couldn't keep any arms. You couldn't even be guardian to your own children. You couldn't educate your child. all these things, forbidden to vote. Essentially, you've had all your human rights stripped from you with just a series of laws here. And most of the Irish at this point were tenant farmers. They did not own land, but there were still a few that owned land and they had some money. So these laws are what really drove them out. The penal laws in conjunction with these enclosure acts. The enclosure acts simply said, if you were Irish Catholic and you owned land, you couldn't do anything with it. You couldn't have crops on it, you couldn't have livestock. There was one thing you could do. You could sell it to an Englishman. Sell it to an Englishman. And that's what they did. And they got out, and they left, and they came here. Now you can see this influx, it's a small influx, but in Boston, in 1820, we had about 2,000 Irish in Boston. Within 5 years, it jumps up to 5,000. Within 10 years, it's at 7,000. And to give you some perspective here, that is in a city of 61,000. So you've got a good small percentage of Irish in Boston now. And the flood hasn't even happened yet. And there's already trouble. Things start happening. You have these early conflicts, as I call them. There's many conflicts between the Irish and the so-called Native American. They're not Puritans anymore. They're the Brahmins, as the term came to be, the Boston Brahmins. We start seeing many conflicts. I'm only going to tell you about a couple here. Here's one that really stings. This is the Ursuline Convent in 1834. This was actually in Charlestown, and it was on a hill called St. Benedict's Hill. It was a Irish Catholic convent. It was mainly staffed by Irish nuns. In fact, the Mother Superior, her name was Mary Moffat. Her nun name, I guess if you can say that, was Sister Mary St. George. You know, St. George who slew the dragon, and she had the personality to fit the name. Now, what they had here was a boarding school, and it was a boarding school for not Irish Catholic girls, but the Boston Brahmins sent their girls to this school because they knew they could get a top-notch education, music, literature, all the finery. I think they even learned some Greek and Latin in there too, a classical education. And these girls went here. And it was no problem for a long time. And then we have some events that start to happen here. There was a woman by the name of Rebecca Reed who actually was Protestant and was able to go to this school on a scholarship. She was poor. She wasn't one of the Beacon Hill Brahmins, and she spent some time in here and eventually wanted to become a novice. That's somebody that is looking to convert and actually become a nun. And then she just left. And the next thing you know, she writes this book called 6 Months in a Convent. And if you read the book, you would think the convent was some kind of medieval torture chamber. You know, the way they treated these girls, that they chained them down and they made them do all these horrible things, and they were brainwashing everybody. And this got out into the public and people began to talk. They started to say, what's going on up at this convent? And then there was another incident. There was a music teacher who was a nun. In the middle of one of her lessons, she had a breakdown and just threw down her baton and walked off. Now, as a teacher, I can understand that. I've had many of those moments. But she ended up in the parlor of one of these Brahmin families, and eventually Mother St. George came down and talked her back. Come on, honey, let's go back. It's okay. And you know, she calmed down, and she was embarrassed that she had this little breakdown, you know. And she went back to the convent. But the story that got on the street was that this nun escaped, and that they dragged her back kicking and screaming. This is what's going on in Boston. In fact, it got to such a fever pitch that people started going to the selectmen and saying, you've got to go in there and find out what's going on. So the selectmen came up to the front door of the convent, and they knocked on the door and they said, we're here to inspect the convent. And Mother St. George stuck her head out and said, no, you're not. I'm not letting you in. So they went back and they complained to the bishop, and the bishop went down and said, let him in, let him in. So she unwillingly let them in, they came in, they interviewed the students, they interviewed the nuns. There wasn't anything further from the story of the dungeon. The girls were happy. They told about how they were learning, how they enjoyed the place. There was no brainwashing going on, none of this stuff. The thing is, they didn't come back to the citizenry and make a report. They didn't tell anybody. So everyone's still clucking. And then this guy comes to town. Reverend Lyman Beecher was a fire and brimstone Protestant minister. And he gave 3 speeches, 3 sermons. In one sermon, he actually advocated burning down the cathedral. He had written a book, an anti-Catholic book, and was there promoting his book. And he actually said, let's burn down the cathedral. Can you believe that? So within days of this, a crowd starts to gather outside the convent. They start chanting. They want to release that nun, that captive nun, and the crowd just reaches this roar. And then it all hell breaks loose. The next thing you know, that crowd, that mob has kicked in the front door of the convent. Now, the nuns and the students saw them coming in the front door, and they went out the back door. They went and hid in the little garden that actually was kind of a graveyard for the nuns. There was a mausoleum out there, and they hid out there. The mob got into the convent, and they started to rip it apart. There's stories of pianos going out the window. They're rifling through the clothes, looking for anything of value, tearing the books out of the book racks, and then somebody lit a match. And it went up. Now, the next day, the sun came up, and even the Boston Brahmins, they looked across the water and they saw this smoldering lump on the hill, and they were shocked. They couldn't believe what had happened. And the mayor actually had the smarts to call out the militia, because I think he had heard that the next target was going to be the cathedral. They surrounded the cathedral. And the next day, the mob formed again, and they started going towards the cathedral. They saw the militia, and they turned around and said, let's go pick over what we left. They went back to the burning embers of the convent. There was nothing left, so they decided to go into the graveyard where those nuns were buried in the little tombs, and they pushed the tombs aside and started going in and taking out the gold out of their teeth. This was Boston in the 1830s. And then there was another incident that is really famous I'm going to tell you about in a second. But there is a memorial out there. It's about 100 yards down the street from the actual spot that it happened. If you go, it's in actually Somerville now, which has been created out of part of Charlestown. That's next to the Somerville Library. But if you go into the neighborhood where this actually happened, the hill's been leveled a little bit, and a neighborhood has been placed here. And you know, as a historian, I love to walk into places like this and just look up in the windows and think, does anybody know what actually happened here? How many people that live in those houses actually know? If they even read that stone tablet down the street, there's nothing left of it. The only thing that really, it's Benedict Street after Mount Benedict. Yeah. Now, if you've ever been to Broad Street, you know that's the financial district of Boston. That's where all the skyscrapers are. This was the first Irish ghetto. And if you look at it today, it's hard to imagine, isn't it? Look at that, a ghetto. But there's still some remnants of it left. If you know anything about brickwork, you can tell they're really old buildings. And I was able to scope out a few of these. This building was probably here in the 1830s when this riot broke out that I'm about to tell you about. Now, the story goes that there was a group of Irish Catholics coming back from a wake. Are the stories true about that? I don't know, but it seems maybe in this case. Because down the street coming in the opposite direction was a gang of Yankee firemen just coming back from a fire. Now, as the two groups were passing, somebody said something to somebody, and a fight broke out. The next thing you know, there's a melee, and there's thousands of people in the street battling out with anything they can grab to smash over each other's head. And the whole thing started to go into the buildings, the surrounding buildings, and people were tearing the buildings apart, fighting with each other. You can imagine it probably looked a lot like that scene right there. Just absolute bedlam. For 3 days, they fought it out. Thousands of people in the streets, and then finally it died down. And the amazing thing about this is nobody died. A lot of people were arrested. Only Irish were convicted, though. I believe it was 9 Irish people. And there were a lot of incidences like this. And then it happened. The Great Famine. There was this fungus on the potato. It started in Maine, folks. Did you know that? And it made its way all around the world to Ireland. How come people didn't starve all over the world? I used to ask myself, you know, with my education that I had, did the Irish just eat potatoes? Well, it's because they were tenant farmers and they lived in these little enclosures. The potato is perfect if you have a little spot of land and it doesn't take great soil, and you can get a great crop just in your little backyard to survive the winter. And that's what they did. When their little potato was gone, when it died with that blight, their food source was gone. They couldn't work on the fields anymore. So if you can't work on the fields, you can't pay for your house, and people started to starve. Now, at first, the British government tried to help. They set up soup kitchens, they set up workhouses. In fact, they actually tried to import American maize. And that was a total and absolute utter failure because they brought in this American corn. The mills in Ireland weren't suited to it. They tried to grind it up. They made it into this gruel that they tried to make into bread, and the people couldn't even digest it. It just went in one end and out the other. So that was a total failure. A lot of it rotted on the docks too. And at least Peel tried to help, and then there was an absolute change in government here. You've got a new prime minister, a new party was in, and they were the Conservatives, and they were more the laissez-faire, which means leave it alone. They believed in the market will take care of this. So leave it up to the market. Prices will go down, people can buy food. It didn't happen. People continued to starve. Between 1845 and 1855, over 1 million people died of starvation. Now, the Conservatives did think somebody should take responsibility. They decided to put the onus on the landlords, the absentee landlords, British landlords, and they passed the Poor Laws, essentially said, you take care of the problem. And they did. When their tenants couldn't pay their rents, they evicted them. And these are scenes of people being evicted from their cottages. And people had to go out into the wilderness and try to make do with what they found. Meanwhile, crops are being exported from Ireland. Over 4,000 vessels carrying food from Ireland to ports in Bristol, Glasgow, Liverpool happened. 4,000 vessels in 1847 alone, exporting food while people are starving. And some of these scenes were actually drawn from life. Artists were making sketches of people that they were seeing. It's almost as if somebody took a picture. And these pictures were going all over the world. People were seeing these in America, Britain. There was no secret what was happening here. In fact, you got to give the Boston Brahmins a little due, because they actually loaded up a ship with food and sent it over to Ireland to help the starving people. Now, this scene I don't think was done from life, but you can imagine this is what people were going through. You look at that woman and you wonder, is she dead? The husband's out trying to scrape bark off the tree to eat the bark, and the little kid here is eating his shoe leather. It was getting that bad. It started in the thousands, and then it rose to the hundreds of thousands. People were dying left and right. One traveler from America was traveling throughout Ireland, and he noticed that as he was going from town to town, there were just dead bodies on the side of the road, just laying there. They didn't have time to pick them up. And he noticed something. He noticed that a lot of them had green mouths. And he asked his host, he said, "Why do they have green mouths?" And he said, "They've been trying to eat the grass." This went on for a couple years. It wasn't just 1 year. The blight came back for another year, 2 years. And the only option was to get out. And sometimes the landlords put them on ships, and sometimes they were able to get on because the fare was so dirt cheap. Now this statue, you would think this is something in Boston. This is actually in Dublin, showing them how they got on the ships. They were sick, they were starving, and they were coming to America. And they called these ships coffin ships. And you can see why. Can you imagine spending 2 months on a ship like that? And they were already disease-ridden, typhoid, tuberculosis, communicable disease, and people were dropping like flies on these ships. And you know, I taught U.S. history for a number of years, and I always taught about slavery and the Middle Passage and the tight pack and the loose pack. And my first reaction when I saw these was that, oh boy, this is too close for comfort. This looks like a slave ship almost. And just like the slave ships, every day they'd be dropping bodies over the side. You can imagine the feeling the people had when they saw land. They saw America. Their hearts must have been filled with joy. And they had heard all these stories. That you hear these, you think it's not true. The streets are paved in gold. There's opportunity for everybody. When they got here, they found it wasn't quite that true. They might have had some family to welcome them, but in most cases, they landed in some of the worst ghettos in the country. Boston, New York City, Philadelphia. New York City was probably the worst. They ended up in an area called the 5 Points in Lower Manhattan. And it was just teeming with thousands and thousands of Irish. And Charles Dickens, who took a tour of the area at one point, said it was worse than Calcutta. That's how bad it was. And then they came here to Boston. Boston probably wasn't much better. And this is how they came. I love this statue. And my take on it, I don't know if this is the correct take. I was looking at it the other day. I'm like, this is what I think it means. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. But I see the other statue that's here, and I see that as the modern American family. And it's juxtaposed as to have the modern American family look at where they came from. That's how I see it. I thought today, maybe it's just some people walking by and going, oh, those poor souls. I think the first is the best. And they came here, and they found it wasn't that great. They were farmers, and they were in cities, and you can't farm in a city. And this is what they came to. Boston. It was crowded already. This is a photograph from 1850 from a balloon. Just to give you an idea, in 1848 alone, 47,000 Irish came to Boston alone. It was a tidal wave, and they were just shoved anywhere you could put them. The neighborhoods that they came into were the waterfront area, the Battery March, Broad Street, which was already a ghetto, the North End, and East Boston. Not Southie. That wasn't until later. We think of Southie. That wasn't even on the map yet. The North End was the Irish ghetto. Next time you go and have a nice Italian dinner at the North End, think it was an Irish ghetto. And they came here. to these fetid streets. They were just shoved into these places like sheds, barns, stables, low-ceiling garrets, basements, and cellars. A lot of these places would flood often. Horrible. And just to give you an idea here, one survey showed that there were 67 toilets in 118 houses inhabited by 540 immigrants. And 17 of those toilets were out of order. In some cases, one sink might serve a whole stinking tenement. One outhouse in one case actually served an entire neighborhood. And they were already sick. And when they got here, it got even worse. There were people dying here in Boston. But it was better than starving, living in these conditions. Here's a nice alley in the North End. I was up there recently. And me, I always look at places and I go through the time machine. This is like the time machine. This is what it was like. You know, some of these apartments, you have like one person living there. Back then, there was probably 2 or 3 families living in the same apartment. And the North End has changed quite a bit since then. A lot of it was wooden tenements. Now it's a lot of these brick buildings were built around the turn of the century. But you can imagine Hanover Street looking like this. Just some scenes. The good old days. And how about jobs? What was available for jobs? If you were a woman, not much. You had the option of being a maid or what they called a washerwoman, a scrubber woman. And that meant that you were on your hands and knees probably all day scrubbing floors up in Beacon Hill. And that's pretty much all you had open to you. Now men, there were many other job opportunities. You could be a waiter. Remember, they're farmers. They don't have skills. Now, you couldn't even be a barber because apparently in the 1840s and 50s, the African Americans had the corner on the barber trade in Boston. You could work in a grocery store, kind of like 7-Eleven. Or you could work in one of those sweatshops that didn't have one of those signs on the outside that said, "No Irish need apply." And I know there's been a lot of stuff on the internet that these signs didn't exist. They did. Now, imagine this. You're lucky. You got a job. Now you're going to be working about 7 days a week, 7 to 14 hours a day, in stifling hot weather in the summer and freezing cold weather in the winter. Your job was constant. You didn't get breaks. For lunch, you'd be eating at your machine because you were doing piecework, and that meant the more product you turned out, the more money you got. So you stood at that machine all day working. But it was better than starving. And you worked in this beautiful metropolis. This is before the EPA and OSHA and all that stuff. And there were jobs on the waterfront. You could be a longshoreman or a stevedore. And they didn't have cranes and big trucks back then. Everything that went on that ship was on the back of somebody. And that's how it got on. And it was back-breaking, hard labor. A lot of these men that did these jobs were dead by the time they were 50. There's the waterfront as it was back then. Here it is now. Vacant. And there were people that actually made their living just digging clams on the beach. This is a photo I found of a group of Boston Irish clam diggers. And of course, the quintessential ditch digger, blacklegs, muckraker. That's what they call them. And it was probably the worst job you can think of. Look at these guys. Do they look happy? And the funny thing is, as I said, a lot of these men died before they were 50, and one common thread that runs through some of these political figures I'm about to talk about is that they all had fathers that died at an early age, doing things like this. But you know, it was the Irish that built Boston. And I'm going to show you graphically how that happened. It started with removing Beacon Hill, and that was used to fill in some of the marshy areas in Boston. This is how the Puritans found it, and this is what the Irish did to it. By 1830, the Mill Pond area was filled in with Irish labor. 1845, the Great Cove in the South Cove. If you ever go to Chinatown, there's a street called Beach Street, and there's no beach on it. That's because there was at one point. West Cove, and of course the Back Bay. It was a back bay, that's why it's called the Back Bay. This was all done with Irish labor. Now, you can imagine with that flood of immigration, and this is a very timely topic, isn't it, folks? There was a massive, massive backlash. And it all came about with this new political party that actually started off as a secret society, the Native American Party. They were also called the Know Nothing Party because they met in secret, and if you ever approached a member and said, "So, what are you doing in these meetings?" they would be like Sergeant Schultz. "I know nothing." And that's how they were, very secretive. But eventually, they grew and they grew and they grew, and they took over political power in Boston like you wouldn't believe. Here's something that says what they were in favor of and what they were opposed to. In Boston, they swept the entire electoral system in 1854. They took every state constitutional office, including the governor's office. They won all 40 state Senate races and carried every U.S. congressional district. Out of 381 seats up for election in the State House of Reps, they won 379. This was a massive landslide. Their governor, his name was Henry J. Gardner, ran on a platform of eradicating the Irish immigration problem. He stated in his inaugural address that the biggest problem facing them was the massive Irish Catholic influx, and that they had to do something about it. And they did. Immediately, they started passing legislation against Irish Catholics in the form of various forms here. One form was they said that there was only one Bible that was to be read in schools. And can you imagine, they don't even read the Bible in school now. Reading of the King James English Version Bible, that was all, nothing else. They banned the teaching of all foreign languages, disbanded all Irish militia units, and they proposed a constitutional amendment to the Massachusetts Constitution that forbade Roman Catholics from holding any office in Massachusetts. It failed by a slim margin. Under the Pauper Removal Act, they removed 1,300 Irish paupers that were collected in the asylums and shipped them back to Liverpool, which was the point of departure for many Irish. And also they formed a joint legislative committee on the inspection of nunneries and convents. Oh. And this is a cartoon showing just what they did. Here is the Delta Force inspecting those convents to see what nefarious acts these nuns were up to. And oh my goodness, they found a cross and a rosary. And under here, what could this be? They used to call it the thunder jug back then. Chamber pot. I hope there's nothing in it. Now, this is a funny cartoon. When you look at the rest of the country, it wasn't just Boston. The whole nation seemed to be anti-Irish and anti-Catholic. And all you have to do is look in the newspapers. What's coming over here? The poorhouse from Galway. Let's turn them around and send them right back. Now, if you look at this very closely, those are not alligators. Those are bishops in mitre hats. Here they come, they're attacking those innocent Native Americans. This is overt bigotry. Here's a nice portrait of a nice Irish fella. It is actually nice compared to what I'm going to show you. This is how they commonly would depict Irish. Drunk, monkey-looking brawlers that sat around and did nothing all day. That was the common perception. And if you're Irish Catholic, you know the truth. It was that they were hard-working, diligent people. This is a black mark. And I don't know what he has on his head. Is that a thunder jug? I don't know. Here's another one. And they all have this monkey-like appearance. And oh my God, don't let them get involved in politics, because you know who controls the Irish. The Pope. I think they were saying that up until about 1960, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, and there was another group they didn't like too much either. The Chinese. I don't know who they didn't like more. I don't know by that one. And who would you like to be your nurse? Florence Nightingale or Bridget McBruiser? Horrible. And of course, the paddy wagon, which is still used today as a term. The paddy wagon. And there's the monkey-like looking Irishman. Paddy. Well, after a while, the Irish had had it. They started to organize. It started with this fellow over here, Patrick Maguire, was first-generation Irish. He put himself through law school, and he decided to give back to the community. He formed a club called the Young Men's Democratic Association. This was the first ward club, I guess you could say. People started gathering here. They started talking politics. They started planning. They started saying, let's get people elected to office. And first it started out with dog catcher, lamplighter, little things like that. Before you knew it, they were getting people elected to city council, state representative, state senators. And then finally, they were able to get a man elected mayor of Boston. Now, I call this the age of cooperation because they did it with the help of you can't see it with the table there, I guess, the help of the liberal Boston Brahmins. Now, the liberal Boston Brahmins worked cooperatively with some of these Irish, and this fellow here, Hugh O'Brien, was elected in 1885 as the first mayor of Boston. Now, the Boston Brahmins referred to him as a nice, clean Irishman. I guess he wasn't like, what do you call it, shanty Irish? And then shortly after him, the third Irish Catholic mayor was Patrick Collins here. I don't know if you can see that. He was elected in 1902. Now, before you knew it, these ward clubs started popping up all over the city. And the biggest and the best one was in the West End, and it was run by this fella. His name was Martin Lemansney. And he was such a powerhouse in the West End as far as a ward boss. They called him the Boston Mahatma. People knew in the West End, if you needed housing, if you needed a job, if you just needed food, if you needed something, anything, you went to the Mahatma. And you know what? You got it. But there was one thing you had to do for him. People are nodding their heads. You had to vote the way he told you to. He controlled the West End. He said, vote for candidate X, everybody voted for candidate X. Very, very powerful. And that's his club, the Hendricks Club. It's would be located down around Lemansney Way, if you ever get to the West End. There's a street named after him now, down near Boston Garden and around there. Now, he had a few proteges, I guess you could say young men that kind of studied at his foot, on his knee. Here's one. That's young Johnny Fitzgerald. Ball of energy. He was from the North End, and he was involved in all sorts of political clubs, a ball of energy, worked for the boss over in the North End. You know, and one day a reporter was nearby within earshot, and he heard everybody calling him Johnny Fitz, Johnny Fitz. He didn't hear it right, though. He thought they were calling him Honey Fitz. And the name stuck, Honey Fitz. And he was kind of a protege of Martin Lemansney. And across the river in East Boston was P.J. Kennedy, who owned a couple saloons. And that was a place where people gathered and they talked politics. He started doing favors for people. Eventually got elected to state rep, and these guys started getting very involved in politics here. And then shortly after them, this gentleman here, this is young James Michael Curley. They would figure in Boston politics for the next 30, 40, 50 years. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of them. Now, young Honey Fitz, you know the story, Fitzgerald Kennedy. When you think of the Kennedys, what do you think of? You think of Palm Beach and Hyannis and the yachts. This is where he lived. That's the tenement building that he lived. After his father died, he had to take over and support his family. Not only his family, his immediate family, his wife and kids, but his brothers and sisters too. And they lived in this tenement building. It's a 4-garden court right near the Paul Revere house. And it still looks dilapidated. Looks like they haven't painted it since he moved out. Rose Kennedy was born in that building. Now, as I said, he worked for the ward boss in the North End. Before you knew it, the ward boss died and he stepped right in. With the help of Martin Lemansky, he started running the North End. When he would see people from the North End outside the North End, he'd say, "My dearos!" They were his dearos. He loved those people. What a politician. He was the thing was he would go to saloons and bars, and he was a teetotaler. He didn't drink, but he would break into the Sweet Adeline at the drop of a hat. And then across the river, I said, there's P.J. Kennedy. Here he is older, and he became very influential. And here is the meeting of the two families. They used to vacation at Old Orchard Beach in Maine. Here you see there's P.J. Kennedy. There's Honey Fitz. This young Joe Kennedy right there, and Rose Fitzgerald. And you know where that all went. Oh, you might even know that young whippersnapper right there. Yeah, that's PJ as an older man. Now, James Michael Curley was another story. He lived over on the south end, down near, I guess you'd call it BU Medical Center. It used to be Boston City Hospital. And he lived on Northampton Street. I actually found the address that he lived at, and it was right next to this building. So you can imagine it was probably the same type of building. His father was one of these guys that worked digging ditches. He was on a road crew. Big man, big hulking man. And one day, some of his fellow workers said, "Hey, see that big boulder over there? I'll bet you can't pick it up." And he went over, picked it up, and then had a brain aneurysm and died right on the street. Now, his mother was devastated. She had 2 boys to raise. And he was, I think he was in 8th grade. He had to leave school and go to work. And he went to work as a drug clerk. And he had the gift of gab. Plus, he was very well read. Even for an 8th grade dropout, he could quote Shakespeare verbatim. Smart guy. At one point, he was working in the drugstore. He did deliveries, and one of the customers said, "Boy, you should be a politician." And he took him up on it. And before he knew it, he was elected to city council. And he worked really quick. Before you knew it, he had his own political club called the Tammany Club, of all things. But he almost got run over right out of the gate. As a city councilman, he ended up getting arrested, put in jail. Here's the story. One of his constituents came to him, and he said, "Oh, James Michael, I couldn't get that job as a postal clerk." "Why? How come?" "Because I couldn't pass the test. I couldn't spell Constantinople." And James Michael Curley said, "I'll fix that for you." Next time the test came, he went in, masquerading as this man, sat down, took the test, and passed it. But he got caught. He got arrested and put in jail for it. You would think that would be the end of his political career. It was actually the best thing that ever happened to him. His political enemies would hit him time and time again. He got elected to mayor 4 times. He was elected to Congress. He was governor of Massachusetts. Every time they go, "Didn't you get arrested for fraud?" And he would say the same thing. He would say, "I did it for a friend." Boom. And that went right out to the people, and they thought, here's a guy who's willing to stick his neck out to the point of getting arrested for us. And he got elected over and over and over again. James Michael Curley. If you want to visit his political club, that's what it looks like now. That's actually not the same building, but that's where it was. A lot of research here. Now, Mayor Carlin's second mayor of Boston dies midterm. Martin LeMancy has the next mayor all lined up. But Honeyfitz wants to run. And he goes against his mentor and runs against the machine. And he actually beats LeMancy's candidate and becomes the third mayor of Boston. Honeyfitz Fitzgerald, mayor of Boston. By this time he had his own political club down the North End called the Jefferson Club. A little bit better than the Tammany Club. And he ran on, this is his slogan. This is actual a Honeyfitz card here. Bigger, better, busier Boston. And he did that. He brought a lot of business into Boston. He did make it bigger, better, and busier. But he was still operating like a ward boss. And he'd move into the city hall here, and he'd come in every morning. There'd be a big line down the hallway of people looking for jobs and housing and all this stuff. Now, by this time, he had actually started running against the liberal Boston Brahmins, accusing them of all the problems of the Irish. So they were against him, and they started accusing him of bribery and graft, and they formed a committee called the Good Government Association. Curley would later call them the Goo-Goos. And after one term, he was voted out of office. And this is where he had his office here. Did you know they were going to demolish this building in the early 60s? And this is what replaced it. Oh, I hate that building. Oh, God. I heard they were going to demolish it. That'd be nice. That concrete desert. Anyway, sorry. And Honeyfitz, he loved being mayor. And you can see it in these pictures. He, when he ran for office, he would be all over the city. He'd be bopping in and out of places. You know, if somebody had a wake, he'd show up at the wake and glad hand everybody and then blow out, and the widow would be looking around going, I didn't know he knew my husband. He didn't. He was actually elected 2 times. And here he is in old age, down in Palm Beach. And I have a couple interesting stories to tell you about Honeyfitz in Palm Beach. Here he is. That gives you him right there, the little leprechaun with his hat. And this comes to us from Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy actually told this story that when the Kennedys would be down in Palm Beach, Honeyfitz would go down there and he'd stake out a place in the lobby of hotels with an ear out to the desk. And if somebody came in and checked in and said they were from Boston, he would just leap out of his chair and say, "My dearos!" and probably get a free lunch and give the whole tour of West Palm Beach, too. That was Honeyfitz, and I think a lot of that got into Jack. That sense of humor. And here he is. And he is buried at St. Joseph Cemetery in West Roxbury. Died in 1950. Long life. Here's another memorial you might remember to Honeyfitz. The John F. Fitzgerald Expressway. How many people spent hours on that thing? Yeah. Not much has changed. It's just underground now. And now we have the Rose Kennedy Green. Yes. Now, this is interesting. Mayoral race of 1913 pitted James Michael Curley against Honeyfitz. The early polls, the newspapers reported Honeyfitz was way ahead. James Michael Curley was still a youngster. He was still just a city councilman. Nobody really knew who he was. Now, as I said, Honeyfitz would bop into all these places all day. He was like just an energetic campaigner. But at the end of every day, he would end up in this roadhouse outside of Boston. And again, he was a teetotaler, so he wasn't there drinking. He just would calm down there. And every night, he would have a nice dance with one of the cigarette girls, and her name was Toodles. Toodles Ryan. Now, one night when he was dancing with Toodles, he gave her a kiss on the cheek. The problem was one of Curly's men was in the room and saw it. Now, the next thing you know, Mrs. Fitzgerald receives a black-bordered letter in the mail outlining this horrible adultery. It was just a kiss. And she's sitting there on the steps of their house, and he comes in the door, and she's sitting there with this letter, looking at him with a real Ricky Ricardo moment. You got something to explain, you know what I mean? And he must have had the gift of gab, because he talked his way out of it. He explained what happened, and she was okay with it, and he saw exactly what it was. It was James Michael Curley playing a dirty trick, and he said, I'm not going to give into it. I'm not going to drop out of the race. You can imagine Curley probably sitting at home watching the newspapers, waiting for that announcement. Honey Fitz is going to drop out. It didn't happen. So he went to plan B. He decided that he would announce that he was going to be doing 2 lectures. And he put this in all the newspapers. This is James Michael Curley going on a lecture tour. One of the lectures was entitled, Great Lovers in History, Cleopatra to Toodles. The next one was Great Libertines in History, Henry VIII till present. When Fitzgerald saw that, he saw the writing on the wall, he was seeing that his name was going to be dragged through the mud, and he decided to drop out of the race. Probably said, I wanted to spend more time with my family. Well, you could say that James Michael Curley became the 4th mayor of Boston by default. And I love this picture, because it shows him. He was a tough guy. He didn't play by the rules. James Michael Curley. Thus began the age of Curley. You know, he got elected mayor about every 10 years, 4 times. And my theory is, if you know James Michael Curley, he would get elected and then people would figure out how crooked he was. Then he'd get thrown out of office, and about 10 years later, they'd forget how crooked he was. He'd get elected again, they'd throw him out. And for about every 10 years, he'd get elected mayor of Boston. Now, when I did my research on Curley, I thought, I love this guy. I hate this guy. There's the good and bad of Curley. There was a lot of good that he did, and there was some bad that he did. Do you want to hear about the good first? As soon as he got elected mayor of Boston, he moved into that beautiful city hall. First thing he did was to give the scrubber women mops. And you might be saying to yourself, what's so great about that? If you recall, the scrubber women were down on their knees scrubbing the floor. His mother was one of them. And he gave them dignity. He actually said, no woman should be on her knees unless she is praying to God. That was the good Curley. There are other stories, so many public works buildings that he was behind, the bathhouses in Southie, Boston City Hospital. Most of that hospital was built by Curley, not with his money, of course, but it wouldn't have been built had he not been mayor. Also, there's even individual private stories that we have of Curley. This comes down to us, this story that I found out comes down to us from his driver. And nobody knew about it until after Curley died, in fact. His driver recounts that often nights Curley would get out around 10, 11 o'clock, and his driver would be sitting out there. There'd be nobody outside the city hall. A lot of times there's this one guy, Mike, who was a drunk, and he'd be out there staggering up a city hall. And James Michael Curley would come with a 20 in his hand and shake him and say, here, Mike, here's the money I owe you. And it's not like today where you would have cameras and TV and everybody there. Nobody knew about it. That was the good Curley. He cared about people. He truly cared about people. Now, here you see him through the ages. And I said he got elected about every 10 years, right up until the 1940s. Here's where we start with the bad Curley. This is his little cottage on the Jamaica Way. He bought this his first term as mayor when his income did not add up to what he paid for the mortgage. He couldn't have possibly got it with the money that he made as mayor. When confronted with this by the papers, he simply said, well, I have investments with this plumber friend of mine who his name had McDaly, and this is how I made all this money. No, it wasn't. He was dirty. He was taking bribes. And we have stories of this. This is the a great story. This is how it would happen. He had a roofer come to him one day up at the city hall, and the roofer said, I'm out of work, can you help me, Mayor? And he looked through his thing, he says, well, yeah, there's a school over in the south end that needs a roof. And I'm coming with these numbers out of my head. It's a $20,000 job, but put in a bid for $25,000. You know where the other $5's going? That's not the end of it. So the roofer goes to the school, climbs up on his ladder, and inspects the roof. It's perfect. It's pristine. He thinks, oh, he's got the wrong school or something. He goes back to Curly, and he says, there's nothing wrong with the roof. And Curly goes, oh, just go up there and make like you're doing something. Come back down. That's the bad Curly. And he would do this on all sorts of things, fill his pockets. It's said that he had 2 safes full of money in his house. Now, by the time he reached his 4th term as mayor, he was thinking of retirement. He was thinking of taking all that cash and investing it someplace. And he found out about this silver mine in Nevada. And he went out there, and these young guys, it's like the cons conning the con, took him into their mine, and they said, look at all the silver. It was like sticking out of the dirt. And Curly was entranced, and they said, how would you like to be the president of this company? And he took it hook, line, and sinker. Next thing he finds out is that they're using his name and the company to peddle political influence down in Washington. Curly gets sucked into this. It's a federal probe on mail fraud, and he ends up being convicted in a federal court and sent to Danbury Prison in Connecticut while he's still mayor. Now, every politician all over New England signed a petition to get him out early, except for one. His initials were JFK. This is in the late 40s. Congressman John F. Kennedy, comma. Well, eventually he got out, and he actually served out the rest of his term as mayor after he got out of prison. And then he attempted to run for a 5th term shortly after that. And I've got a picture of him running for his 5th term. You can see these are 1940s, obviously. This next picture here he is, 5th term. And how he got that license plate is another shady story. I won't tell you that either. But he didn't get elected to a 5th term. And then he just became this sad character that was hanging around the State House trying to drum up odd jobs. A story comes from Tip O'Neill, of all people, who was a congressman. I guess Curly approached him and asked him if he had anything he could do. And Tip knew the situation, and he said, yeah, James, how about you go out and drum up some donations for me, get some donors and get some political donors. And he said, yeah, I can do that. I have connections and everything. But then shortly after that, some of these donors started coming up to Tip O'Neill and saying, I thought I gave you $5,000. Where'd the rest of it go? He was up to his old games once again. But he wasn't making the money like the old days. He became this sad character. But he didn't go out that way. He went out with a bang. And it was because of this book. This book was written by a young writer in Boston, Edwin O'Connor. And it was about a fictional mayor named Mayor Skeffington. But if you read the book, you knew it was word for word about Curly. It was all Curly. It was so bad, O'Connor confided to some friends he was afraid of running into Curly. In fact, at one point in Curly's career, he actually ran into an editor that was writing editorials about him and knocked him out on the street. O'Connor knew that. And one day, O'Connor was getting out of his car at the State House, and here comes Curly walking up to him, and he thought, oh no! And Curly reached out and shook his hand and said, I love the book, especially the part where I die. He loved it so much he started lecturing around the state as Mayor Skeffington, referring to himself as Mayor Skeffington. And then, of course, it was made into a movie starring another Irishman, Spencer Tracy. And that's how Curly went out. Shortly after that, he passed away. And here's his final resting place in Roslindale, Mount Calvary Cemetery. Now, if that's not a very good shot, I shot that. I should have my wife do it. She's a professional. If you look very closely at his gravestone here, I got a better shot here. It's kind of like his resume. Yeah, all those things that he did. But I think the thing that he valued the most on that stone was what's on the bottom there, and that is Mayor of the Poor. Now, another honor that he got because he was governor for one term was that he laid in state in the rotunda of the State House. And I've talked to people that were in this line. The line went up and down the streets. There were people that loved Curly. Many people loved him. A lot of people didn't like him. Now, if you're in town and you're around Faneuil Hall, you can stop in and have a chat with him. They thought so much of him, they had 2 of them put in there. Now, every year I take my 8th graders here on a field trip, and they love him. They sit next to him and rub his belly and everything. And I say to them, I say, kids, do you know who that is? And they say, no. Of course, it's not on their phone, so they wouldn't know it, right? So I say, look on your phone, look up him. That's James Michael Curley. You should know who he is. James Michael Curley. So, in conclusion, I'd like to say that these people, the Irish, they came to our shores and they endured ethnic and religious bigotry. They endured squalid, wretched, cramped living conditions. They endured backbreaking menial labor. But in the end, they persevered, they overcame, and they prevailed. And thank you for coming out tonight.